The air in Philadelphia was thick, not with summer heat alone, but with something invisible, electric, dangerous. It was July of 1776, and the city trembled with a secret everyone could feel, but no one dared to name aloud: freedom. The whisper before the storm. Horses clattered down cobblestone streets as carriages rattled past brick taverns, where whispers grew louder with each passing hour. Inside the Indian Queen Tavern, the smell of roasted meat and spilled ale mixed with the sound of argument. "We'll hang for treason if we sign that paper," a man in a rumpled brown coat hissed. "Aye, but if we don't, our children will curse our names." Across the city, in a rented room at the corner of Market and 7th, Thomas Jefferson sat at a small wooden desk. A single candle burned beside him, wax pooling on his notes. His quill scratched furiously against parchment. He hadn't slept properly in days. The task before him was monumental, to write words that would shatter an empire. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Jefferson paused, staring out the window. He could still hear the echo of the last debate in the Continental Congress. John Adams, fiery as always, had stood before the delegates and declared, "The question is not if we are free, the question is whether we have the courage to declare it." Those words burned in Jefferson's mind. He dipped his pen again and wrote the words that would define a new world. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." He stopped. The ink shimmered under the candlelight. For a moment he just stared, knowing these words would make kings tremble. Across town, the Pennsylvania State House, later to be called Independence Hall, stood like a fortress of decision. Inside, 56 men were at war with their own fear. Some were lawyers, some merchants, some farmers, yet each one carried the weight of 13 colonies on their shoulders. The debates had dragged on for weeks. Could they really sever ties with the most powerful empire on earth? Could they survive the wrath of the British crown? Benjamin Franklin, ever the pragmatist, had summed it up dryly: "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Laughter had rippled through the chamber, but behind those smiles lay terror. Signing that document meant death if they failed. As Jefferson wrote, his thoughts wandered to Virginia, to his wife, to his estate at Monticello, to the quiet life he might lose. Yet something stronger than fear pushed his hand. He thought of the Boston Massacre, of the tea dumped into the harbor, of the young men who had fallen at Lexington and Concord. He thought of Patrick Henry's cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Jefferson's quill moved again, faster now, as though the words were being dictated by history itself. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He leaned back, exhausted. In those words lived everything: the dream, the risk, the rebellion. Outside, the church bells tolled 9. Somewhere in the city, a drummer boy practiced his cadence, a steady, rolling beat that sounded like the pulse of revolution. The next morning, the draft was carried across the city to the Congress. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin arrived first, their coats damp from a light rain. They read quietly, their eyes scanning each line. Franklin smiled faintly. "Tom, you've written something that'll make the world listen." Adams nodded, more serious. "Now we just have to make them believe it." The Congress gathered again. Windows were shut tight to keep out prying ears, but the summer heat inside the chamber was suffocating. Tempers flared, voices rose. South Carolina wanted the slavery clause removed. New York hesitated to vote at all. Others demanded edits, rephrasing, compromise. For days, Jefferson watched as his words were sliced and stitched. Yet he said little. He knew this was bigger than him. It wasn't about authorship. It was about unity. Every signature would be a spark. Together, they would ignite a fire that could never be put out. By July 2nd, after endless debate, the vote was taken. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained. When the gavel struck, silence fell. Adams wrote to his wife that night, "This day will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America." But the real magic was yet to come, when the words themselves would be approved, finalized, and sent to the world. July 4th, 1776, a clear blue morning over Philadelphia. The Declaration, freshly printed by John Dunlap, lay on the table in the State House. The ink was still drying. Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams stood side by side, watching as the clerk read it aloud. When the words "United States of America" echoed through the hall, a tremor passed through every heart present. Outside, church bells began to ring. The sound spread through the streets, over the rooftops, into every tavern and alley. Citizens poured out of their homes, unaware that they were witnessing the birth of a nation. Children ran with flags. Old men wept. A mother held her infant high and whispered, "You'll grow up free." Inside, one by one, the delegates stepped forward to sign. Their names would forever mark the turning point of human liberty. As John Hancock pressed his bold signature, he smiled grimly and said, "There, now King George can read it without his spectacles." Laughter rippled again, nervous, defiant, proud. They didn't know what would come next: war, blood, sacrifice. But in that moment, they were united by a single belief: that freedom was worth everything.
The price of freedom. The parchment was signed. The ink was dry. But freedom, real freedom, was yet to be won. Philadelphia buzzed like a storm hive that July night. In taverns and homes, the people whispered the word independence, as though it were both sacred and forbidden. Bells still rang faintly in the distance, echoing like a prophecy. And far across the Atlantic, in London, that very word would soon thunder through the halls of power like a cannon shot. The message crosses the sea. Weeks later, a ship called the Mercury sailed from the American colonies bound for England. In her hold, among barrels of tobacco and crates of letters, lay a copy of the Declaration of Independence. When it reached London, it spread faster than rumor. Printers rushed to reproduce it. Pamphlets and newspapers carried Jefferson's words to every corner of Britain. King George III read it in disbelief, his hand trembling as he reached the line, "He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns." The king slammed the parchment down. "Rebellion," he muttered, "nothing but rebellion." But in the smoky taverns of London, something strange began to happen. Ordinary people read the words aloud, and some nodded quietly. Freedom had a strange way of crossing oceans. The streets of Philadelphia. Back in America, the document was read publicly for the first time on July 8, 1776. The crowd gathered outside the Pennsylvania State House, merchants, sailors, farmers, mothers clutching their children. A hush fell as Colonel John Nixon stepped forward, unrolled the parchment, and began to read. When in the course of human events, his voice carried over the heads of thousands, every sentence drew cheers, shouts, and even tears. When he finished, the crowd erupted. Church bells rang, drums rolled, and a cheer went up that could be heard across the Delaware River. A British flag hanging nearby was torn down, shredded, and burned. The revolution was no longer whispered, it was shouted to the sky. The war begins anew. But celebration quickly gave way to grim reality. The British were not going to simply let their colonies walk away. Within weeks, red-coated troops landed in New York. Over 30,000 soldiers, the largest force Britain had ever sent abroad. Their ships lined the harbor like a forest of masts. From his tent on Long Island, General Washington watched through his spyglass. He had fewer men, less training, and almost no supplies. Yet he stood resolute. The fate of unborn millions will now depend on the courage of this army, he told his officers. The declaration had been signed in ink. Now it would have to be defended in blood. The Fall of New York. August 1776. The Battle of Long Island. The American forces, brave but inexperienced, faced overwhelming firepower. British cannon roared, smoke filled the air, men screamed as musket balls tore through ranks. Washington ordered a retreat, a desperate nighttime escape across the East River under the cover of fog. Miraculously, not a single man was lost. Many later said it felt as though Providence itself had sent the fog to protect them. When Washington reached the far shore, he looked back toward the city now burning behind him. He whispered to his aide, "This is only the beginning." Voices of the People. While battles raged, the Declaration of Independence traveled from town to town. It was read aloud in courthouses, churches, and fields. For farmers, it was a promise. For soldiers, a reason to fight. For enslaved people, a distant hope. One black soldier in the Continental Army, Lemuel Haynes, copied the entire declaration by hand, keeping it in his pack as a reminder of what the war meant. Meanwhile, in New York, British General Howe declared anyone who supported independence would be branded a traitor. Hundreds were arrested, some were hanged. The colonies were learning that freedom demanded sacrifice. The Hall of Courage. Back in Philadelphia, the Congress remained in session. The delegates knew that every British victory brought the hangman's noose closer. Still, they refused to flee. Benjamin Franklin worked tirelessly to secure support from France. John Adams urged the colonies to send troops, food, and gunpowder. Late one night, as thunder rolled outside, Franklin turned to Adams and said quietly, "You realize, John, this will cost us everything we have." Adams nodded. "Then it will be well spent." Winter at Trenton. By December 1776, the Revolution seemed to be dying. Washington's army was starving, barefoot, freezing. Many had deserted. Then came Christmas night. While British troops celebrated across the river in Trenton, Washington gathered his men. They crossed the icy Delaware River through wind and snow, silently rowing past sheets of ice. At dawn, they struck. The surprise attack routed the Hessian garrison. For the first time in months, the Americans had won, and hope returned like a sunrise. When news reached Philadelphia, bells rang again, echoing the spirit of July 4th. Across the world. The Declaration of Independence was no longer just a colonial document. It became a symbol. Translated into French, Dutch, and German, it inspired thinkers and rebels across Europe. Even philosophers in France began to whisper of liberty and equality. Thomas Jefferson would later write, "The flames kindled here have spread to other lands." But at that moment, he was simply a man watching his words turn into war. The meaning of a signature. Each name on that parchment carried a personal cost. Some signers lost their homes to British raids. Some were imprisoned. A few, like Richard Stockton, were tortured. Yet none recanted. When asked years later whether he regretted signing, Benjamin Rush smiled and said, "I signed because I believed the cause was just. I would do it again, even on the gallows."
A fire that would not die. By the end of 1776, the Revolution had survived its darkest days. The Declaration, once just ink on parchment, had become the living heartbeat of a nation in struggle. In the camps, soldiers recited its words by firelight. In the cities, people whispered them in prayer. Even in defeat, those words gave them something the British Army could never capture: belief. As the year ended, Washington wrote in his journal, "We have declared independence, but we have yet to earn it." The world was watching. The storm had only begun. And out of that storm, a new country was being born. One that would fight not only for survival, but for an idea that could not be killed: freedom. Fire and resolve. Snow fell in slow, silent sheets over the American camp at Valley Forge. The year was 1777, and the dream of independence hung by a thread. Washington's army, ragged, hungry, and broken, huddled in makeshift cabins. Their boots had worn away. Many wrapped their feet in rags. Some had no coats at all. From the ridges above, the wind carried the sound of distant British drums from Philadelphia, now occupied by the enemy. The Revolution, it seemed, was bleeding to death in the snow. Inside his log cabin headquarters, General George Washington sat by a dying fire, reading a tattered copy of the Declaration of Independence. The paper was creased and smudged with dirt, the ink fading, but the words still burned. He whispered the familiar line, "All men are created equal." He closed his eyes, remembering the moment he'd first heard those words read aloud. Back then, it had sounded easy, glorious even. Now, the cost of freedom was measured in frostbite, hunger, and graves. At that very moment, out in the snow, a young soldier named Joseph Plum Martin, barely 17, carved the word liberty into a piece of wood with his knife. He didn't know why he kept fighting. He just knew he couldn't stop. The spirit of rebellion. Then came a man with an accent thick as the Black Forest, Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had once served in the armies of Europe. He arrived in Valley Forge in a blue uniform bright against the snow, shouting commands the soldiers barely understood. But his energy was contagious. "Discipline!" he roared, pacing between the lines. "If you fight like farmers, you will die like farmers. Fight like soldiers, and you will win." Day after day he drilled them, marching, turning, loading, firing, until the army that had once scattered before the British now moved as one. By spring, the Continental Army had been reborn. When Washington inspected them, he saw something new in their eyes. Not despair, but resolve. The summer of 1758 brought new hope. Thanks to Benjamin Franklin's tireless diplomacy, France had recognized the United States as an independent nation. French ships set sail with supplies, soldiers, and one of history's greatest military minds, the Marquis de Lafayette, a 19-year-old nobleman who'd left behind wealth and comfort to fight for liberty. When he arrived, he bowed to Washington and said, "I am here to learn, not to teach." He would become like a son to the general.
The tide was turning. The colonies were no longer alone. The betrayal. But not all hearts stayed true. In 1780, the Revolution faced a wound from within, the betrayal of Benedict Arnold. Arnold had once been a hero, wounded in battle for the cause of freedom. But pride and resentment festered. He felt unappreciated, overlooked, unpaid. The British saw their chance. They offered him money and rank if he would surrender the American fort at West Point. The plot failed. The British messenger was caught, and Arnold fled into enemy lines. When Washington learned of the betrayal, he stood silent for a long time before saying softly, "Whom can we trust now?" Even in victory, the Revolution had begun to show its cracks. The South burns. The war shifted south. In Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, the fighting grew brutal, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. British forces burned towns, raided homes, and hunted rebels through the swamps. But the Americans fought back with a new kind of warfare. Quick, hit-and-run attacks led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. In the forests, among the cypress and mist, Marion's men struck like ghosts, vanishing before the British could respond. Each ambush carried a message. The Revolution would not die quietly.